Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for the 14th edition of the FreeFuse sessions. I'm here today with Indy Sen. Indy is a global marketing and technology executive with 20 years of B2B experience. He's built and led go-to-market functions at some of the most notable SaaS hypergrowth companies of the past decade, including Salesforce, Box, Mulesoft, Google Cloud, WeWork, and Matterport. And Indy is originally from France, but now based in the SFA area. He holds a dual Bachelor of Arts in Economics and International Relations from Brown University and an MBA from MIT Sloan. And we're so excited to be able to chat with you guys today about the aspects of customer journeys. But before we hop in, I'd like to give Indy an opportunity to kind of add a little bit of color to his experience. So once again, Indy, thank you so much for making the time out today.
Mike, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and honored to be on this ongoing series that you have. So, happy to dive in and great to be here.
Absolutely. And, as kind of maybe a first glance of, what we're about to be talking about, one of the first times I ever met you, right, was basically going into this idea of how we could construct a really, really solid, product experience, right? And you were one of the first people to really, kind of help me conceptualize the idea of that first time user experience, right? Mm-hmm. And all the diagrams you showed me really kind of fundamentally allowed me to change my thought process of how developing the product and, in conjunction, the marketing around it was so important. So I always like to wonder where people came from in terms of how they got to this point. So where was it along the line that you started to really dive into customer journeys and build some of these thought processes into how you build product and marketing?
Yeah. So for me, where it all started and where I really got into the thick of the, designing the user journeys and the thinking about what that customer experience looks like, that first time user journey, right? Like FTUI, right? Like are the acronym that you and I had talked about. Was really, as I was kind of growing into the shoes of a marketer, right? Like, I would say, at the beginning of my marketing career, I was, more of like a content producer. I would take my cues from a lot of teams and I would kind of inherit a lot of those first time user experiences and then respond to them with like, proactive content or sometimes even reactive content being like, well, our website doesn't do a very good job about telling what we do, but our first call pitch deck will, right? And those kind of things. And a lot of times you knock one thing after the other. But when I really got the keys, I would say to first of all, think about what that overall first-time user experience would look like, head to tail, I would say, was probably when I was at Mulesoft. In Mulesoft, I joined them back in 2014 when, this was pre-IPO, pre the Salesforce acquisition. And my role there was to lead developer marketing as well as developer relations, what then that ended up being. But that was the first time where I was kind of given the keys of an entire marketing funnel and where, my responsibility was to make sure that we could acquire developers at scale and even get them to not only, sign up, but of course, use the product. And then once they were using the product, to make them habitual users of the product. And not only that, so hopefully with that product adoption, they would become customers. But the holy grail of that whole user journey was by, it was to figure out ways in which we could even turn some of those successful developers into evangelists, right? So if you think about full circle, sort of like full stack marketing from top of the funnel to middle of the funnel to the bottom of the funnel, how do you design an experience that's going to get to those specific goals across each stage? And how do you then, in some ways, take a step back and think about what is that overall experience that draws not only from marketing, right? Especially when I think about top of the funnel, I think a lot about marketing because it always goes to speak towards how have you heard about a product? Why are you going to visit the site? And when you're on the site, what are you going to do before you sign up, right? Like that's a lot in the kind of the province of marketing and brand, I would say. But then as soon as somebody signs up, I think when you and I were chatting, when we first chatted about this, that's where that first time user experience then also obviously encompasses what that product experience is going to be. Once you have to sign up, what is that initial onboarding flow, right? Like in the developer world, it's one of the key metrics that we look at in the middle of the funnel is what's called the time to hello world, right? Or like that aha moment, that moment where you trigger this reaction that cuts deep with the developer being like, you know what, this solution is exactly what I need. Or inversely, it's going to be, Yeah, this is not what I thought it would be, but at least I know to cut my ties here. But then so I think that handoff between marketing and product and user experience and design, right? Everything that leads up to that moment is going to be critical. But then going back to the last thing I was mentioning at the end of that experience is how do you turn these successful customers who've adopted a solution into repeat customers as well as potential evangelists, right? And I think that's where you also need to think about what that product experience is going to be, not only between the handoff between marketing and product, but also product and customer success and marketing, of course, right? So I think it takes a village to really think about that user experience, but that's exactly what I ended up doing when I was at Mulesoft. I was saying, hey, you know what, our website has not really changed, since we were first like an open source sort of developer first community. And what now that we're trying to straddle both the open source concept as well as more like enterprise kind of user journeys, how do we come to with like a just middle between those two things, right? And we had to refactor a lot of things, including the website, the sign up process, the documentation. But that's where it was the first time where I really got to have a chance to really flex that muscle.
Yeah, and obviously with the concepts that you were able to draw during that period of time, clearly there was a lot that you were able to experience that helped you build up almost like the skills, but also maybe the instinct to be able to say, here are things that actually sort of as part of my funnel are not in place. And then even I think a lot of people forget, once you get them actually, even let's say your model is a freemium model, when you get them to sign up, obviously they haven't necessarily upgraded to a premium account, you're still in that mode of trying to deliver to them that aha moment. And it's funny because like I feel like every team has their own colloquial saying for what that term is, aha moments, or like the eureka moment, or whatever it is. And so I think that what a lot of folks I think miss is really being intentional about architecting that aha moment, right? And so if you're like, let's just say an earlier stage company, or maybe somebody who's even architecting some of their own ideas, right, and really trying to think about how am I going to get someone to this point, what is the thought process around trying to be intentional about getting someone to that first aha moment? And are all aha moments created equally?
So I think you asked first about what is the process you follow to kind of like figure out what that aha moment is, and then what are all aha moments created equal? I think that's a great question, because in my mind sometimes, and this of course depends on the solution, right? The go-to-market motion. Is this like a product-led motion? Is this a sales-led motion? But I think in general it behooves you, and this is maybe where marketing can take a very strong point of view on this to kind of lead the efforts, is around knowing who your audience is, depending on what channel and touch point they're coming from. Who is that person that you're trying to market to and get to, to adopt your product? And then also knowing what is the job that they're trying to do, right? So hopefully your website, and the reason why they kind of first came on your properties, because they have an inkling saying that, hey, FreeFuse might help me, or Mulesoft or Matterport might help me. Now let me sign up and see whether this is what they say on their site matches the product experience. And I think, a lot of times it's tempting to try to be, especially, I've worked at a lot of platform companies, and a lot of times you try to be everything to everybody, because you're like, hey, we're like an AWS, or we're like a Salesforce.com, like we got everything, come on in and we'll show you, right? But often, you have to understand the usage patterns, right? And like maybe sometimes you can take inspiration of like where your book of business has led you. Like at Mulesoft, for example, we knew that very quickly we had not just, I wouldn't say outgrown the core like iPaaS integration solution and problem solving, but very quickly people were coming to us for like API design and management. And then they were also coming to us for like hybrid cloud connectivity, right? Like I have my servers sitting in Oracle, but I want to connect to my Salesforce instance, right? And so I think what we tried to think about was, in designing those user journeys, we realized that, one size would not fit all, right? And I think that's one of the biggest sort of like pieces of advice I would give to any customer or any company that's looking to implement these user journeys, is that, very rarely will one size fit all, both in terms of like, the core product sign-up experience, as well as like depending on where people are coming from, right? Are they coming from like a web advertisement? Are they coming from mobile, right? So I think you want to be sensitive to who's coming in from where, and then there's also what are they trying to solve. And at Mulesoft, one of the things that we did, and maybe this is because we had not literally, like I was making the joke that this website had not looked like it was updated since 1998, which is more of a testament of how kind of like ancient looking, and how little thought we had put into the product experience since we had first launched. I think it was more of a manifestation of that. But that being said, obviously it got us to a certain level, but then how do we take on these new opportunities? And what I tried to do was think about what are those happy paths for each of those users, knowing that our three core use cases, one, obviously people using us a lot for integration, but API design and management was an emerging use case that we knew that we could kind of like proudly like hang our hat on. So in some ways we were trying to get people there as well. And a lot of times people came to us for just saying, hey, you do integration, right? They had no idea we did API design and management. But what we wanted to do was saying like, yes, this is our bread and butter, we still do this. But if you think about it, it really makes sense to think of us as also your solution provider for API design and management, because at the end of the day, you're building APIs against a certain agility layer, like a certain data repository that you want to kind of hit and have either internally or externally have customers and developers be able to use. So Mulesoft is a great starting point of course, for connectivity, but then designing APIs on top of that is not just the cream on top of it. It's part and parcel of what we do. So, we try to like take a step back and think about it. Well, how do I define and, grease the skids towards each of those three user journeys? And then, of course, also knowing that depending on the users, if they're not looking for education, they're just looking to kind of roll up their sleeves and get in a command line interface and do those things. We also made sure that, we had documentation, placed prominently, right? Because I think in my experience, there are many types of developers, but the two biggest kind of cleavages I would say is between developers who are just like, don't tell me anything. I'm going to look at your docs, and if I'm not productive in the first 10 minutes, you guys suck, right? And then there are also the other type of developers being like, well, my boss is asking me to look into the solution, and I want to make sure that you have what we need to do. And not only will I look at the documentation, but I'm going to see like, can I even set my junior developers on this, right? As opposed to me having seen how some of this stuff has been built and done and me figuring out myself. Can I have someone a little less experienced? Can you help hold their hand on this, right? So we had to be super sensitive to the fact that they could be both, right? We didn't want to kind of gild the lily too much on the user journeys and creating friction where friction was not needed. But we also wanted to be attentive to the fact that, documentation had to be robust, right? And like if somebody wanted to start it there, that they would be successful there as well. So I think to your last question about our user journeys all created equal, again, yeah, I think I probably touched on this, but you have to, it always stems in my mind, and you don't want to overcomplicate things. You don't want to have to, I would say, thread the needle across too many things, right? Because it's going to be very hard to measure, right? And I think as a vendor, you want to, in some ways, construct user journeys in a way where you're saying, not only will you capture the people who you think you want to capture and who you want, but you can also, in some ways, whittle out the people who you may not be the right solution provider for, right? So I would not try to be all things to all people. I would be very selective as to who you want to be to whom, right? And start from there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that ability to focus is one of the most important aspects, right? And, in terms of actually figuring out what metrics you're trying to hit, I think that kind of gives it the weight of which journeys are the ones that you really want to invest more of your time and efforts into, right? And I always love the term happy path, right? The idea that someone's going to go over there, accomplish X thing, and there'll be smiles on their faces, right? So, that's, and I think that what happens to a lot of people is they look at a lot of this data that they get from like folks coming in, maybe they put in Pendo, maybe they've, still utilizing Google Analytics or some other maybe internal thing that they built in. But sometimes it might be challenging for them to actually develop that, two things, right? The data story that comes out of what actually is, kind of this lagging indicator. This is what happened. Here's what we're recording of this. We can have a cadence of looking at this every 1 day, 3 days, 7 days. And then there's kind of like the preemptive story process, which is writing out what the experience is going to be. And I recently read this book called Story Mapping, which was a really, really nice book about having all your experiences kind of match a narrative of like a film or a really good story. And I thought that framework was actually really effective towards looking at, okay, so if you're somebody who's in X market and you're sending them down, you know, a bunch of steps and they're not reaching sort of like this climactic moment where they feel like they got, you know, this aha moment or this wonderful part of the experience, then you're giving them this, and that's not that exciting. Ergo, they're going to either leave or have a bad impression of you versus competitors and things like that. So you know, I've always appreciated the idea of intentionality there. So I guess in a sense, what are your thoughts on how people can think through how they, you know, let's just say you have somebody who's trying to think through a new experience or trying to remold their experience, right? How might they be able to perhaps utilize you know, a thought process similar to this to set themselves up best for success? How are they going to be able to construct a good, well, you know, well-crafted customer journey without necessarily getting lost in the weeds of like all the data or like, you know, things that they might feel intuitively are actually part of that journey?
Yeah, yeah. I love, so I'll have to make a note of that book later on that you mentioned, because I love consuming that type of content, because it just makes you smarter as a marketer, as a product person, and so on, right? And I agree, you know, like I think the stakes now are such that, you know, you obviously have some companies that have completely mastered that you know, product experience, right? Like if I think about, you know, everybody's going to pick Apple, right? But let me pick Sonos actually, because you know, like everybody, you know, maybe this might teach something new to the audience. But you know, I recently got a new Sonos speaker. It's actually the one that's back there, the portable move thing. We had a garden party for our fourth grade parents. So you know, we needed music and you needed alcohol, and everybody would be happy after that. But you know, I've always admired what Sonos does when they think about, you think about a physical product, right? From the minute you're unboxing the product, you know, like, and we had to think about this a little bit at Matterport also when we were working on next generation hardware, was what's that unboxing experience? Is it going to be rewarding? Is it accretive to everyday associations that you have from a brand association with like a Sonos, and like what your expectations are? And if you're a first-time user, are you kind of creating these little bit delightful moments, right? Like the fact that even the speaker, and this is a trick I think that even you know, Apple does very well, is that they realize after a couple of years that, you know, you want to get going with your new device right away, right? So while it may have added some, you know, some steps in the supply chain to have a device partially charged, the fact that you can be out the gates and, you know, turn on your iPhone and have it say hello, like the way, you know, the old Macs used to, or you know, the Sonos, the fact that you can start playing music within like 10 minutes right after, once you're connected, that stuff matters, right? And I think it goes back to maybe what this book or this research you were looking at touches on, which is the best way to think about this is put yourself in the shoes of like that designer, right? Or if you're even maybe I think you were using a movie analogy, like you and I mean, I'm a huge movie buff, right? And so I know within minutes whether there's like, whether the movie, not that necessarily whether the movie will be good or not, but that attention has been spent to the craft. And of course, we live in like the peak TV, peak movie age. So more often than not, you know, there's really great people who are working on this stuff and they're going to delight you from the get-go. But every now and then I'll see like a Netflix show and be like, yeah, they spent all their budget getting the star, but this movie sucks. You know, like within the first 5 minutes, you know that it's like, you know, like those old action 80s movies that were, you know, like some, you know, like some like obscure like Israeli studio that like hired, you know, Stallone to do like a movie, you know, like and those are cult movies, by the way, now too, right? But they're good because they're bad. Now, going back to your question, I think, you know, there's nothing wrong with putting yourself in the shoes of like this experienced creator, right? You know, just maybe 2 weeks ago, Brian Chesky from Airbnb went on this, and I think I love what they're doing from a go-to-market standpoint, because it's very savvy, right? Like they have 2 releases a year, but when they have a release, obviously there's a blog post, there's some media kind of coverage. He does podcast interviews, but he repeats, he knows exactly what he's going to say. And right, and this was all about going back to their roots, right? I think one of the big quote unquote innovations was to be able to, you know, rent a room versus an apartment or like a physical space, right? And living in the times that we are, it's a smart move on their part, because one, it goes back to their roots, but also it makes it much more affordable. And, you know, when inflation is this sky high, you want to visit places, but you don't want to break the budget on where you stay, right? So super well timed kind of experience. But in one of the things in many of his interviews, especially, and even on what they were doing on their social channels, they actually made it a point to show what their storyboards look like, from the very beginning of kind of how do they redesign or refactor this experience, remold this experience, to use your words, to meet the needs that they had. And I've taken a screenshot. Maybe I don't know if we can attach things to this at the end of the podcast, or for anybody
Absolutely.
who's listening to it. But I'll share it, and it's in the public domain. But again, I nerd out on this stuff, so I was like, you know what, I want to talk about this because like this in my mind nails it. Because here you are, you're designing an experience, a software experience, and of course, I think Chesky and his team, a lot of them, they came from, I think they're designers at heart, right? I think Brian Chesky was at the Rhode Island School of Design, which is one of the best design programs in the world, right? But it is telling that that's what's informing some of the decision-making process in what that product experience is going to be. And too often I've seen too many teams, and sometimes it's because it's a big team, or sometimes, and I think this is the kiss of death for a lot of startups, is when engineering goes out and talks about how they're going to implement a thing, and then they're going to say, okay, well, marketing, here's how it's implemented, go and like, activate users and those kind of things. I think it really behooves any, team, entrepreneur, business unit, if they've given an opportunity to rethink what their user experience is, go back to literally that drawing board, paint the storyboard, right? Like think about what that design process is, not from the vendor perspective, from the user perspective. With Airbnb, I think they had, I'll end with this anecdote, is that I think they had this ribbon of like, literally storyboards with pictures and stuff, but then also like bullets at the bottom of each, where they said, here's what the host is going to see. Here's what the guest is going to see. Here's what we're going to see on like the back end, right? And if anything, just to visualize those things, right? Like I think the payoff is huge, because that's where you uncover silos. That's where you uncover, some maybe antiquated thinking or processes that need to be revitalized for you to kind of really get to where you are. And totally get that sometimes you can't refactor everything. At Matterport, for example, for the longest time, we were sort of like shackled by just how our billing and revenue ops stuff was kind of put together ahead of being able to make more interesting motions from a user experience standpoint. But I think that has now been taken care of, right? So I think that's, so a lot of times you won't be able to create the best experience you want to have, but at least have the vision, right? At least go in with that in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there's a certain element of gathering data versus having, a certain level of fidelity in your model, right? Yeah. For example, right, like, low fidelity model, you literally have a bunch of Post-it notes on a, whiteboard, you can mix and match, you can see if things work. And then it's really just about how do you quantify with data, and then, I'll obviously get some level of, data that's not necessarily just quantified data. It's like, stuff that you're doing in terms of maybe user interviews and like things that you're actually going out and talking to folks and getting all that qualitative information. So I think that there's always kind of a tension between how well can I understand that this data is giving me signal and not noise, especially when you have something, for example, if you had an idea for a user journey and you were at McDonald's and you wrote something on a napkin, you want to be able to know that your napkin sketch actually holds some weight, right? So, if we're thinking about something maybe in those sort of primordial stages of, hey, I think that this is going to make an improvement, how do I, go about really testing if this is true? If you're somebody who maybe doesn't have a lot of data about how that experience could work, how might you go about that investigation process then, right?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think sometimes, a lot of times when you're kind of given the keys to these user experiences, and I think, typically we've talked about a lot of the more mature companies where that comes straight from the top, right? But if you're in there and your gut tells you that your solution should have some certain element that's going to make or break the user journey, at least come in with that point of view, right? Like I think sometimes if in the absence of data, first party data that you have on your own side, right? I mean, try to get that data if you can, right? Because there's nothing like making a convincing argument that's data based, and especially if it's based on your data. But one thing that I've often come back to is sometimes, and especially when this is at heart going to be a cross-functional effort, right? It's not just going to be the PMM that does this. It's not going to be the product designer that's going to do this. It's we were talking about this before. It's like, it's product, it's marketing, it's customer success, and then some, right? I think what's always good is sometimes have a vision of what, and I think this is typically what I've also do when I'm having conversations other than, other than design and user journeys, but it's also like have a strong opinion of what great looks like, right? And come and say like, look, I've looked at the competition. I've also looked at like, who are the companies that we try to emulate ourselves after. And this is the pattern matching that I can do, right? Like, the first time experience user of like, Strava is very similar to what like, Sonos does or those kind of things, right? Like, and sometimes to kind of, how would I say, to kind of trigger that aha moment internally, sometimes it does benefit you to kind of have examples from outside, right? Like what I call like outside analogs, because in many ways, if you choose those examples well, people are like, well, holy shit, if I could wave a magic wand, of course I would want the unboxing experience of like Sonos or like Apple, right? But I also have to deal with my budget, right? So, but I think that's where, using external analogs, or at least it's going to help set the tone of the conversation in terms of at least figuring out, are you talking about having the same kind of standard, or or are you even caring about the same things? If somebody at Matterport told me that they didn't care about the unboxing experience, at least I would know that. But I would probably lead in saying like, hey, I've looked at our mood boards and we did care about the unboxing experience, so that was good news. But if you're newer to the organization, sometimes, while you may not have the data or it's going to take a while, but you need to like come in with a strong point of view, at least come with that straw man, right? And then have people kind of like, pick at it. But I think you can always draw on like other data, like the analog data as an example of being like, well, here's why this is so successful. Now it's successful because this company cares about unboxing. But if we don't care about unboxing, or if our customers don't care about unboxing, that's a moot point, right? But it helps you zero in on like both what your company values are and how they're gonna, and what your users want, and then how that translates into what that user experience should be.
Yeah, and you bring up so many great points with that, right? Because, I think a lot of what folks really look at is, how can I essentially craft this, sort of perfect thing out the gate, and they realize very quickly, every plan that you might have thought of, or every, way that you might have thought about your product or service might actually be completely wrong. Right. And, you need to have some level of, agility to be able to move away from, a hypothesis that was incorrect. Right. And for me, I always, encourage folks on our team to contribute, even if they feel like, hey, this is more of an instinct sort of thing. I'd like to bring this to the table as why I think this is important. I always want to be able to hear those thoughts. And I remember there was I think it was maybe the teams at Netflix or something. I read a book a while back from like Patty Ford, right? Where she talked about, I think, how like people would actually argue points at their company. And what was really interesting was they did an exercise where you would have to argue the other side's point, because then it would allow you to actually look at a complete picture rather than siloing off. Well, let's use the unboxing still as an example. I don't think unboxing is important for X, Y, and Z reason, right? And so, yeah, they might both have good data or thought processes to show why that's true, but being able to argue the other person's point is really unique, because now you get to see, okay, so now I understand where they came from. Do I still feel the same way? And if so, then how do I communicate that, and where does that come into the way that we're going to deliver value for these people? So I think that what you also hit on the head was organizational items, right? The actual organization itself, it can't be just a practice that you do, or like, hey, there's like a couple people doing this and they're thinking this way, and then the rest of everybody's like doing some other process, or thinking through some other paradigm to understand and deliver value for customers, right? So and when you're talking about organizing yourselves, building up how your team, your company, maybe in the early days, is thinking about these problems and thinking about how all of these things mesh together, what were some of the things that you felt like were crucial towards getting that harmony, getting that buy-in, and most importantly, getting the results from everybody moving in the same direction?
Yeah, when you're in the process of kind of crafting that user experience, or or advocating for a better user experience and then trying to land it, right? I think the key thing is, I think we talked about, coming in with a strong point of view, getting people aligned, right? And then actually doing the work. And I think that, doing the work is actually obviously going to be the most critical thing here, right? Like, I mean, you could wax philosophical about like, hey, we should be like Sonos, we should be like Apple, we should be like, Airbnb. But until you actually start doing, the wireframes, until you start thinking about, well, okay, let's look at the data, like, how do we know, like, if the data tells us that somebody's only going to be likely to sign up as a paid customer if they've done something within the first 10 days, well, we got to absolutely get them to do as many things as possible in those first 10 days, right? And that's going to take like a multifaceted approach, right? Like, it's going to be nurtures, it's going to be, validation within the tool, it's going to be, little prompts to kind of get them, inspired to do things, right? So I think it's going to come down to execution, right? I think the best way in which you can kind of get the payoff from that user journey is to, communicate, right? So I think I speak of this as, someone who's typically been a very cross-functional leader. Like, I think you mentioned this in my background, but I've built and led marketing functions, but specifically product marketing functions. And in product marketing, you're that classic servant leader within an organization because, as deeply immersed as you are with, the product team, the sales team, and the marketing team, right? Like, I've been in enterprise software, so I've worked a lot across those three areas, specifically with sales. At the end of the day, when the sales deal goes through, sales owns the deal. They make the money. The product marketer does not make the deal, right? When the product launches, product marketing, you help position it, message it. You probably ghost wrote the blog post. Like, all of the products I've helped launch at Google, I ghost wrote the posts. I ghost wrote them for like product managers, for VPs, for, you call it, right? But I'm not the one who gets promoted necessarily, right? Like, it's the product manager that does, or like the product manager like gets the, the tap on the shoulder for launching that product. So all this to say is that, you have to influence without authority. And I think the best way to do that is to kind of, one, over communicate, and then two, show the results and the findings as quickly as you can. So, I don't know if this is for everyone, but, like my last, the last time I did something as cross-functional like this was actually at Matterport, where, we were I was across our growth initiatives, and I had this kind of, SEAL Team 6 of like, engineers, product managers, marketing, folks on my team. And we are just trying to put some points on the board. And we did end up putting some on the board, but we also did not in certain areas where, sometimes people would not show up at meetings, and it would be the product person, it would be the design person, the engineering person, right? So a lot of the points that we put on the board ended up being like on the marketing side of things, right? Like everything from the top of the funnel to the middle of the funnel, right? Where we said, like, if you want signups, we've turned these dials here and there. We've gotten as many signups as you want, right? But now we're gated by the fact that, we've gotten the signups, but they're not doing anything within the first 10 days because our product, our user experience, our, the onboarding journey has not changed. And we've seen the designs, but we haven't shipped these designs. So you have to be able to like show the plan, communicate the plan, and even like help prioritize. And this is where don't do things in a vacuum. I would say, here's some bets that we're going to make where our sentiment is that, as a team, we believe our biggest bang for the buck is going to be if we change this, or we tune this dial here, or we, add this, we take out this field in the sign up form, but add this one, right? It's going to be very nitty gritty type of things, but develop a backlog, right? And so I think you can guess that, in the way we did this, or sometimes I've seen it done, is sometimes, at the end of the day, yes, there's aspects of go-to-market, customer success, but at the heart of it, it's a product experience, right? So the way I helped design that was I steered it towards an agile process, right? Being like, hey, let's do 2-week sprints. And, it could be 3 weeks, it could be 6 weeks, but have things that you can come back and talk about. And it's not uncommon for like, to kind of use that methodology because one, it's one that product and design will snap to, but even marketing, like I think the fact that you're going to say like, hey, let's make some measured controlled experiments and determine like, by what time we'll determine whether this experiment was a success or not, right? And so there's certain things where, hey, if this moves the needle on getting even a fraction of people signed up in less than 10 days, it's a nudge in the right direction. If it has a no effect, I think we'll be able to know that at the very least within 10 days, right? So I think it's communicate. I think there's this Chinese proverb, I don't know if I'll do it justice, but it's probably in Chinese, so it's going to be a translation anyway. But it's like, when you enter any game, know what the rules are, know how much you're gonna, know what your bet is gonna be, and then know when to like fold, right? So probably like know when to hold them, know when to fold them, right? But with any experience that you're gonna try to engineer across the board in the user experience, is that figure out as quickly as you can what are the things you're gonna double down on, and then what are the things that you're gonna, you move away from the backlog or consider it done, right? Because even if the experiment did not succeed, that's still a conclusive end to that experiment, right? So you can retire that and move on.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think inevitably what ends up happening is there's the need to gather data very, very quickly, right? And I feel like the earlier you are, the smaller your experiment should be, right? Because I feel like, if you're more established or, have been doing, sort of maybe a sales-led motion, you're trying to understand more of the product-led motion, you at least have something that's not obviously going to tank the company. You have like some kind of lifeblood coming through, and you can kind of sort of afford to have longer running experiments, right? Things that maybe you can test something in a week, test something in a month, and then test something in a quarter, right? Like, because certain results aren't actually some things can obviously be broken down into a smaller bit and have like a leading indicator to allow you to know, okay, clearly this doesn't work, even if we've started this whole process out, right? Like this, we can dump this, right? But I think in some cases, like, for example, I think a lot of folks give up on the content marketing aspect. Like, for example, a lot of people tell you, hey, you need to be creating like, blogs, but it's very generic of why you need to be creating that, or like what you should even be doing it. So a lot of our thought process to even developing content like that was we already had a sales-led motion in place. So we just took a bunch of the questions that showed up during demos, literally created a giant compendium of all those questions and made a post out of every single one. And, frankly, it was, number one, it helped us scale better because we didn't have to talk about those every time during demo calls. And, now you can send them as collateral to people and they can pass them around, and it's not telephone when somebody says, hey, we had a good demo. This is this, and this. And like they explain certain aspects of it incorrectly. So, we had a lot of like built-in things that were, good for us, which is why we went down into the foray of like building out, a content customer success-esque type of experience, right? But I think a lot of people look at like blogging, they look at the internet and say, okay, cool, like this is something that gets me SEO. This is something that, does this, and there's not enough intention behind it. And then there's not enough speed. So they get frustrated about the idea of doing X amount of work, unless you use ChatGPT, but X amount of work, right? And then not getting the results. So, do you agree with the notion that, maybe perhaps in the early days, your experiments should be shorter, or should be, things that you can quickly get like as much, quick hitter data as possible? Or do you think you can be more intentional and allow for experiments to run for a quarter, 6 months, or whatnot?
Yeah. I think I will say that it probably depends on what you're trying to move the needle on, right? Like if you're testing a button and testing whether the button should be green or red, right? Like I think you'll know that fairly quickly, right? Because the data will tell you. There's some fantastic tools like from Optimizely to, other things that will determine that. But I do think when you think about content, especially, and, like the overall, whenever I think about content, obviously I think about messaging and the overall storytelling, the promise that your brand is making to this company, right? Sometimes content, more often than not in enterprise, it's one, showing the vision, right? It's delighting the customers, showing them a better way, right? Like, typically some of the best enterprise brands I've been across, or even consumer brands, are saying like, look, this is the old way of doing it. We're going to take you from there to here, right? So the from to framework, right? So a lot of times when I think about content marketing, it's about showing that you're opinionated in this thing, that you're gonna you're helping lead the way, right? You're inspiring them. It's aspirational. But there's also a lot of content that's going to be more blocking and tackling, right? So I think you have to thread the needle between delighting and inspiring, as well as objection handling. And in enterprise, especially, objection handling is key, right? Or even in the consumer space, right? Like, why pick Android versus iOS, right? So there's probably a very, certain brands lead with it, others don't, but you got to bet that both Apple and, Google will have certain pages about like, switch to iOS or switch to Android, right? And some companies lead with that versus others, but it's always in somebody's back pocket, right? So I think you have to thread the needle again between inspiring, educating, and kind of like, influencing, more consideration and awareness, to, saying like, well, we're not dumb. We know that there's like 5 other solutions that do the same thing. So why you, right? And I think in content marketing, that's where sometimes I don't want to write off experiments too quickly, because sometimes content probably has exactly the right message but it may also be how you deliver that message, right? So if you posted a blog post and that was more than 500 characters long, or was plenty of links, and that where there was but then you didn't, it was just a one and done, it may be a hit, but it's probably going to be like a one and done thing, and then it's going to be on ice, right? I'm a big believer that sometimes when you have, or if your gut tells you that you have the right content, you got to try and remix it in different formats, right? Like break that blog into, or if it's an ebook, break that ebook into a blog series. If it's a blog, break that blog into snippets on Twitter, like to activate people, whether it's like TikTok, Twitter, so on, right? Reuse and repurpose that content, because you never know which channel is going to respond to it best, right? And also what aspects of the content, right? Like a lot of times it's very tempting to be like, well, we are big believers in re-engineering, defining category for this. So let's write like this opus on this, right? And there's some people who are going to consume an opus. There are some people who are being like, bro, I don't have time for this, right? And so I think you have to be very conscious when you're deploying content marketing, not to be afraid to repurpose the content or to reuse it, because you'll know when you hit the vein with like a certain channel, and then you'll also know when something like the format is not the right one for your audience and those kind of things. But I would not give up on content, because one, it takes a while to produce, right? I mean, granted, we live in this chat GPT age where if you have, there's probably going to be a time in the future where I upload our verbal identity and that kind of stuff, and like a bunch of things we're working on, and then boom, I'll have a blog post, right? But more often than not, it's still going to take somebody's time, a subject matter expert, to, especially when you're thinking about threading the needle between objection handling and inspiring, right? It might be your time, right? It's going to take you like 8 hours to write this really considerate blog post, but that, you don't want to just let it die on the vine on the blog, right? Because it may still be great content, but you've only had one shot at putting it in front of people. So use that content, use elements of it in your newsletters, use elements of it on your social media. So, back to what I was describing, with the Airbnb Brian Chesky example, like, I think I probably, maybe because I'm a fanboy, I was like trying to, I was consuming their content because I was like, this is great. But he literally ended up having the same talking points on his podcast interview that they had on social that they did, right? So I think about what those master messaging and the prompts are, and then don't be afraid to reuse them, because you never know, to your question, when something will hit. So I would to sort of repeat, to kind of recap what I said, is with content marketing in general, I think you want to give yourself the time, but also know that when you need to kind of remix and refactor some of the content, but don't go back to the well, right? Like, just because something did not resonate once doesn't mean it's not going to resonate again.
Yeah, and I think that's what ends up happening is, when you're early and you're just trying to, sort of throw anything against the wall to make it stick, right? Like you're just hoping, like, hey, something's gonna, go, and maybe that one blog post, goes well. Like maybe you get like 20 or 30 likes, you get like 10 inbounds from that, and you feel good, and maybe you can iterate off that process. But what happens to a lot of folks is they don't get the distribution right. And I think it's like a larger testament to not getting distribution right as an organization.
Yes.
You know what I mean? So
100%.
Yeah, and going back really quickly to the point that you had about the from to, it's really interesting that you mentioned that, because there's been a lot of people talk about sort of the different parts of our brain, right? And they talk about the paleocortex or the lizard brain, right? And they always say that the lizard brain really enjoys contrast. That's why we like the from to stories the best. Like, when you see people like My 600-Pound Life, you see before, after, you see like the weight loss commercials. That's why they do that, right? Yeah. And it's interesting too, because I feel like tying this all together, there was a interesting couple books. I'm sure a lot of people have read or checked out, like Persuasion, The Psychology of Influence, or I forget if it's the other way around. The
Cialdini, right?
Yeah, the Cialdini book.
Yeah.
And then there was like this other book that actually talked about these guys, they're lawyers. They actually created a whole system about actually tapping into like sort of the lizard brain, right? And actually like sort of, and they were actually trying to like basically win over juries so they would win more cases. So it was like a really fascinating, kind of text they put out. And I ended up like, getting that and taking a look at sort of what their methodology was. But I think that all of those things sort of tie into the construct of kind of engineering. It's like almost like a level of social engineering, right? Everything from like when your first touch point that you have with this person, whether that's the blog, whether that's your profile randomly, or whether that's a conversation like we're having right now, that's your first, initial touch point. That's how someone is going to be able to see, well, is this person interesting? Should I interface with them or not? Is there interesting information here? And with the way that our minds kind of have to discern information in order to not like have our brains explode from information overload, the half-life of being able to actually convince somebody that what you're talking about is worthwhile to know is, I feel like, shorter than ever, and the ability to have to wow people. And so I feel like, understanding, I feel like the underlying principles as to why people do things, and then constructing that particular journey around what your, metrics and your KPIs are going to be is kind of like one sort of, entire science and art behind really crafting these journeys. And it's, why I really appreciate you sharing, the book from Tony Fadell, Build. And already started reading about it or reading into it. And already, it's a great book, right? And funny is they have an entire section about marketing, like in like a couple, like I think it's like a chapter or two or something. And they discuss kind of like a lot of this. And the framework that I liked the best was how they were talking about each particular, benefit or like case studies or whatnot. And they have a message activation matrix, right? And they show that whole thing. And I've already instituted it in our team, but I just feel like that's kind of where, you said the repurposing comes from. The repurposing is really a part of that whole entire process. And you can repurpose like a blog that has product features 1 through 5, that you're introducing something new. And then you can go and repurpose that and put it in a social post where you go back and actually have product feature 1, product feature 2, and another one, and so on and so forth. And so, I think that, I think in the early days, you have to kind of spend time sort of doing all sorts of stuff to see just what sticks. But I think over time, that intentionality is, what's really going to win the day. So I appreciate that sentiment from you as well.
Yeah. I think I was just nodding my head because I think this is something that I learned in my time, working at different companies. And as I was fortunate to start my career at Salesforce, where the messaging was so crisp, right? And sometimes they beat you over the head with like the furry mascots and that kind of stuff. But exactly what they're going to talk about when you're at a Salesforce event. But the analogy I've been using now is messaging done right. It's an API. Right? Messaging is an API because, it should be clear, concise, and repeatable, right? And when you have those 3 elements, then it doesn't matter where it is, because yes, you're going to make bets. You're going to be like, hey, let's talk about this message that we have in a blog post. Let's also create like an email, like do these things, right? And the messaging activation matrix, right, that Tony Fadell talks about, that obviously resonated when I was reading the book too. I was like, they have realized that, it's not about a one and done kind of thing. It's saying like, how do you take this payload from the messaging, right? And that's why I use the API model, and but have it be consumed in the way that it's meant to be, right? Like you only need a certain amount of it to kind of prove this point to that audience in this medium, right? And so on, right? Like you're not gonna this is why if done right, like your messaging should be able to give you the legs to say like, hey, this is what's going to go on a billboard. This was going to go on like an advertisement on like the screen on like, Alaska Airways, right? This is what it's going to look like on like a takeover campaign. This is what it's going to look like in a New York Times article, right? Or a New York Times, full page, half page ad, right? So I think that's to me is the mark of like a company that's gotten it right, is when they realize that messaging is an API, and that, and the minute everybody sings from the same song sheet, where there's a consistency and you're not reinventing the wheel, because, investing in messaging, positioning, it takes time, right, to get it right. And you're not going to get it right the first time. But when you're onto something and you're convinced of it, try it, like you're not going to know. You have to look at the longitudinal kind of aspects of it as well, right? And that's why, I certainly responded very well when I was reading that book. What a great read, the Build Tony Fadell book, probably one of my favorite business books for recent years.
Yeah, it was phenomenal, and had a lot of really. It's funny too because he has his like own like personal anecdotes and like funny stuff about like what happened.
100%.
So I know we're running to time here, and so many great pieces of information, so many good discussion points. We could go on and do this forever, but did want to obviously give you the opportunity to, share anything that you'd like to, promote, or, perhaps if there's anything that you wanted to share with the audience, you're more than welcome to do so. But otherwise we can go ahead and wrap up the show here.
Yeah, that's kind of you. Like nothing is really brewing right now. I'm still like like working with a couple companies, advising and consulting to them. But I will say that in this coming fall, so maybe if we can, I'll add a link to this in the fall. Is I'm going to be running the New York Marathon and raising funds for cancer. So maybe if anybody got some value out of this conversation, and when I have my link ready, which I'll probably have in the next couple of weeks or days even. You tell me when this goes out and we can coordinate on that. But if you got something out of this conversation, would love to have your support as I run the New York Marathon.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll put that link into the post when it goes up. So we'll make sure that you get maximum exposure. And want to be able to support you in your initiative for, cancer research as well. And I believe that is a worthwhile endeavor. So, yeah. So in any case, I just want to say once again, thank you so much for the time. And for those of you out there who, did tune in for the entire episode, we just really appreciate your, your time and how much you've tuned in over the course of the last 13 episodes. And we look forward to seeing you for the 15th edition next week.
Amazing. Yes, thank you all. And Mike, always a pleasure.
Yep, absolutely. Have a good one, everybody.